In the restaurant, the tension was palpable. I stood up, my voice firm and sure, and announced to everyone, without hesitation, that the man they called their boss, my boss, was not just the leader of that company. He was my wife's lover. Silence hung over her, a cutting silence, while she, sitting next to her, froze, her eyes wide with astonishment and her skin pale, without reaction, as if the weight of the truth was crushing her in front of everyone. The betrayal, once hidden in the darkest recesses of her routine, now exploded in front of astonished stares. The coldness with which she had tried to manipulate me for so long, her empty smiles when she arrived late at night, the automatic kisses without passion, all came together in a perfect line of minutely calculated lies. Deep down, I already knew. But admitting this betrayal in front of everyone was not just an exposure of it, it was my revolt, my cry for release from an emotional prison where, for so long, I had been trapped, trying to justify the unjustifiable. The incredulous expressions of the colleagues around us burned. One of them whispered something, someone tried to interrupt, but no one really moved. They stood there, static, in the face of my confession, of our shame. She mumbled something that I didn't even care to hear. Her lips trembled, a mixture of guilt and despair showed on her face, but that was the least I expected to see. For a second, she looked to him, the boss, as if she needed some kind of support or confirmation. And there, in that instant, I realized how much she really was willing to risk. How much she chose, without thinking twice, the risk, the desire. She looked at me as if I were a stranger, as if the years we had spent together were nothing more than an insignificant past. Flashbacks of moments I had once thought innocent began to take shape in my mind. She was always kind, of course, always concerned about his work, defending his decisions, praising his intelligence and even his generosity. I smiled, ignoring the obvious signs that were now coming together like pieces of a fatal puzzle. How many times had he suddenly appeared at our social gatherings? How many nights had she spent late at the office, while I foolishly left dinner ready, texted her good night and settled for short replies? Why? I asked, but her answer was an agonizing silence, a pathetic attempt to evade the truth. Had she planned this carefully or was it a slip-up, an adventure turned into something out of control? The restaurant, the place where so much laughter and moments shared with her had unfolded, now seemed like the stage for a tragedy, the place where all the fragments of our lives were exposed and questioned. It wasn't what you think, she murmured at last, but her gaze revealed more than her words could ever hide. She tried to defend herself, but the weight of the situation was overwhelming. The boss, silent, didn't have the courage to speak. His eyes avoided mine, his face lost in an expression of mute guilt, that cowardice typical of those who don't have the courage to face the consequences of their actions. He lowered his head, shrinking back in his chair, without the usual bravado he displayed every working day. And there, I realized that he, the man I was supposed to respect, was nothing more than a puppet, a fool who dared to interfere in what I believed to be a true bond. They tried to carry on the conversation, but the silence had become oppressive, broken only by the sound of glasses clinking on the surrounding tables and the murmur of the other customers who were witnessing the crumbling of what was left of our story. From that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. She was no longer the woman I loved. And he was no longer the boss, the leader. They both became strangers, pitiful figures on the stage of my life. The others around them, who had once been just colleagues, now became witnesses to my pain, my venting, the humiliation I had exposed myself to by trying to recover something that, perhaps, had never really been mine. I wondered, as the voices around me whispered again, how long it had gone on, how many times they had lied, how many nights they had met while I waited at home. How could I have missed it? At what point did I become just an obstacle in the way of her desires? The pain of betrayal wasn't just a fresh wound, it was a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it, which was finally becoming evident. Her face, so familiar and now unrecognizable, became the symbol of everything I had never imagined facing. I loved her, I did my best, I was the loyal and patient partner, while she laughed behind my back. How can anyone allow themselves to throw away the love of a lifetime for a fleeting moment? What didn't I do? Where did I fail? The boss glared at her, as if desperate to escape, but trapped by the gravity of the moment. He knew that the mask had fallen, that all that remained now was a minefield of decisions and consequences that none of us could avoid. They were no longer discreet lovers, now they were just accomplices in an exposed lie, where there was no turning back. "Is that all you have to say?" I asked. Silence answered me. She lowered her head, he looked at the table, without answers, without words, without the courage to admit his mistakes. And then, in the back of my mind, something dawned on me: this wouldn't end here. This was only the beginning of what they would have to face. I wouldn't let the humiliation fade away like this, as if it were just another story told at a bar table. And so, without saying another word, I turned and left, leaving them trapped in the emptiness of their own choices, in the exposed shame of someone who played with feelings without measuring the consequences. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful truth: betrayal destroys lives, erodes trust and leaves deep scars. Get ready for an intense narrative full of twists and turns. Now, relax, but be aware, you're about to hear a shocking story. Have a good listen. That early fall, the leaves of the trees were tinged with reddish and orange hues, coloring the streets and parks of the city. It was a season that always stirred memories in Ethan and his wife, Sarah. Together for more than a decade, they shared a relationship that, in the eyes of others, seemed solid and harmonious. They had built a comfortable life alongside their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, who brought joy and energy to the house. Weekends were filled with family activities, walks in the park, visits to museums and long conversations in coffee shops, a ritual that Ethan and Sarah had maintained since the beginning of their relationship. Ethan worked as a financial analyst for a renowned investment company. He was a reserved, meticulous man, known for his ability to maintain a balance between his professional and personal life. Behind the eyes that were always attentive to numbers and finances, he was a devoted husband and a caring father, who made a point of cultivating quality time with his family. He believed that time was the most precious commodity and made every effort to be present, even if his job required him to work long hours. Sarah, on the other hand, was a free-spirited woman, artistic and involved in the local community. With a degree in architecture, she had found her place in a respected office in the city, where she developed projects for urban and residential spaces. Unlike Ethan, who preferred the safety of numbers and calculations, Sarah felt at home in the world of ideas and creations, often guided by impulse and instinct. Her expansive way of dealing with the world contrasted with Ethan's discreet profile, and this difference between the two was, curiously, what brought them closer together. Each, in their own way, complemented the other, making the marriage a partnership that seemed solid and balanced. Despite their different natures, Ethan and Sarah were admired as a stable couple. During family gatherings or parties with friends, they were often complimented on the complicity and respect they showed for each other. Ethan appreciated Sarah's creativity and spontaneity, while she found in his serenity and rationality the support that helped her balance in moments of doubt. He listened patiently to her when she lost herself in daydreams about the projects she wanted to carry out, and she comforted him with the same intensity when he came home from work exhausted and silent. However, behind this appearance of stability, there were nuances and dissatisfactions that, although subtle, were always present. Ethan, for example, never mentioned it, but he felt, in moments of silent solitude, a certain melancholy. Something that bothered him, perhaps the result of a feeling that routine was beginning to swallow up the spontaneity he so admired in his wife. In recent weeks, Sarah had been spending more time at work, involved in a new and challenging project that seemed to consume all her energies and attention. Although he understood how valuable the job was to her, there were nights when he found himself waiting for her to arrive, looking at the clock and thinking how much deeper the silence in the house seemed without her. Sarah, for her part, was dealing with equally complex feelings. Motherhood and marriage had brought her deep happiness, but at the same time she felt increasingly distant from the impulsive, dreamy young woman she had once been. Work stimulated her, but when she returned home, she felt exhausted and sometimes suffocated by the domestic routine. Although she loved Ethan and was grateful for the life they had built together, she couldn't ignore a growing emptiness in her chest, a longing for something she couldn't even name. There was an internal conflict that she couldn't share either with her husband or with herself. The evenings of conversation they used to have became more and more sparse. When they were together, they talked about the practical matters of everyday life, bills to pay, Emma's school schedule, the needs of the house. Sarah avoided discussing her feelings of restlessness and tiredness with Ethan. She felt that he wouldn't understand or, worse, that he might interpret her confusion as ingratitude for the life they had. On the other hand, Ethan also didn't dare question Sarah about the changes in her behavior. Over the years, he had learned to respect her silences, even when they felt like a chasm between them. One night, after putting Emma to bed, Ethan sat on the balcony, watching the sky tinged with dark and brilliant hues. He felt the cold wind touch his face and wondered to what extent he really knew the woman with whom he had shared more than a decade of his life. Questions arose in his mind, questions he had never had the courage to ask, but which somehow bothered him. Was Sarah really happy? Or was she stuck in a routine that made her dissatisfied, but from which she didn't know how to get out? And how willing was he to question his own comfort zone in order to understand what was really going on in her mind and heart? Elsewhere in the city, Sarah was having dinner with some work colleagues after an exhausting meeting. She was tired, but felt strangely alive in that environment, far from the responsibilities of home, amid stimulating conversation and carefree laughter. There was a mixture of guilt and relief in her heart. She allowed herself to enjoy these moments as a way of breathing outside the bubble of marriage and motherhood. Her boss, a charming and experienced man, often praised her work and had recently started talking to her on a more personal level. There was something reassuring about knowing that someone saw value in her work and her personality outside the family circle. For Ethan, the reality of their lives was a fragile balance between work, family, and the little moments they managed to steal for themselves. But for Sarah, these moments at work had become something more, a way of filling the emptiness she was beginning to feel at home. On the days when she came home late, she felt a mixture of freedom and anguish, as if she were approaching a border she had never planned to cross, but which, at the same time, seemed inevitable. She avoided facing Ethan directly when she got home, fearing that he might notice something in her gaze, some different spark. Ethan and Sarah were, each in their own way, stuck in a routine that seemed to fade the colors of their lives. He, with the weight of the stability he had always craved, and she, with the longing for something she couldn't name. In the midst of all this, they both tried to maintain a semblance of normality, however much their doubts grew in silence. Emma, the daughter who represented their union and the fruit of their love, seemed to be the only point of stability and genuine joy. Everyone, in their own way, clung to the idea that the marriage could still be saved, that perhaps they were just going through a phase. Autumn was advancing and, with it, the leaves continued to fall, covering the sidewalks as if they were vestiges of the days that were piling up, repetitive and predictable. Ethan tried to focus on his work, ignoring the discomfort he felt at seeing Sarah so far away. And Sarah continued to lose herself in daydreams that made her question the choices she had made over the years. They both pretended not to see the cracks, as if they could keep the world they had built together intact. That evening, Sarah was the last to leave the office. She grabbed her coat, took a deep breath and, for a moment, stopped in front of the reflection in the window, observing her own image as if she were a stranger. She felt torn between the desire to maintain family stability and the desire to explore something new, something that could bring back the intensity she had once felt. As she looked at herself, she couldn't help thinking, how long can I keep this up? Meanwhile, Ethan slept, wrapped in a light sleep, unaware of how much the tides of his life were about to change. Sarah's work was beginning to occupy not only her hours, but her thoughts and emotions. The demands of the new project involved her in a way she hadn't felt for years. Every meeting and every detail required dedication and immersed her in a world that made her feel alive, challenged and, in a way, indispensable. With Ethan, stability was like a rope that anchored her to the safe harbor of home, but lately she had been tempted to drop anchor and set sail. The family routine continued, but Sarah began to lose herself between the desire for stability and the freedom to explore other possibilities. On the other side, Ethan maintained his unwavering dedication to work and family, but Sarah's increasingly frequent absences did not go unnoticed. She arrived late, her eyes dull with fatigue, but there was something else, something that seemed to wrap her mind in a fog of secrets. When he tried to talk, she would shy away, change the subject, and Ethan, not wanting to be intrusive, would let the conversation die down. However, the silent nights began to take their toll, and Ethan felt increasingly lonely in his own home. Sarah, for her part, realized that her boss, Michael, was being especially attentive to her, offering to help her deal with the pressure of the project. Michael was charismatic, self-assured and had a keen insight into every detail of the job, and his presence by her side was a kind of escape. He knew how to listen, and his compliments and suggestions made her feel valued, a feeling that was becoming rare in her personal life. By spending more time with him, Sarah allowed herself to smile in a way she hadn't done for a long time, and this lightness drew her in like a breath of fresh air. Their conversations became more and more personal, going beyond the professional barrier. One evening, while they were discussing details of the project, Michael invited her to dinner, saying that they both deserved a break. Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that this went beyond what she had always considered acceptable. But the invitation, made with a calm, confident smile, disarmed her. Accompanying him to dinner seemed like a reward after an exhausting day, a way to forget the stresses and responsibilities for a few hours. And so she accepted. Dinner was light and relaxed. Michael, always so professional in the office, was an interesting, engaging man. The conversation flowed naturally and, for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to forget the weight of family life, the internal demands, the commitments she had made to herself. They laughed about banal stories, shared details of their lives, and she found herself, without realizing it, talking about the frustrations she had been harboring for a long time. At the end of dinner, Michael walked her to her car and, before saying goodbye, held her hand for a moment, prolonging the contact. Sarah felt a wave of guilt and excitement, a dangerous mixture of emotions that she couldn't control. And as she drove home that night, his touch was still throbbing in her mind. Time passed, and dinners with Michael became more frequent, disguised as work meetings. He became an escape point for her, a kind of confidant who knew her worries without judging them. Michael knew how to draw her in without pressuring her, letting her decide how far she wanted to go. Ethan, on the other hand, was trying to keep the peace at home, feeling more and more distant from Sarah, but hoping that it was all just a phase. He tried to reconnect with his wife in small ways, trying to find traces of the woman with whom he had built his life. But her smiles were fading, her deep conversations had become distant memories. And, more, Ethan felt that there was something hidden in her eyes, a shadow that he couldn't dispel. One evening, on returning from another dinner with Michael, Sarah entered the house silently, as if afraid of being discovered, even though she knew that Ethan, tired, had already retired. Her footsteps echoed through the sleeping house, and when she saw the living room, Emma's toys scattered around, and the lighted lamp Ethan had left for her, she felt the weight of the life she was leading and the new emotional journey she was secretly on. Guilt became an uncomfortable visitor, but the excitement of exploring a part of herself that she thought had disappeared overcame this feeling. One weekend, while Ethan took Emma to visit her grandparents, Sarah used the afternoon to put her thoughts in order, trying to understand the extent to which she was involved with Michael. She was aware of the consequences and knew that, with each new encounter, she was moving further away from the family she had always valued. However, the feeling of being alive, of having someone who saw her as a full and desirable woman, was leading her into a trap that she herself, deep down, wanted to ignore. It was a constant battle between her desire to remain safe and her fascination with the new and the unknown. And then, on a night when the intensity of the relationship overcame every barrier, Sarah gave herself to Michael, crossing an invisible and fatal line. Her encounters with him became secret, shrouded in an atmosphere of mystery and transgression. She felt torn, but the forbidden passion filled her in a way she hadn't felt for a long time. In the days that followed, she hid in excuses, in meetings that lasted longer than expected, in justifications that she offered Ethan without facing him directly. And Ethan, even without knowing for sure, realized that something was deeply wrong, that the wife who used to smile by his side now seemed absent, distant, untouchable. The weeks passed, and the family dynamic became even more fragile. Ethan began to observe the changes in Sarah with growing anguish. The absence of touch, the increasingly obvious distancing, the uncomfortable silences between them created a barrier that, for him, was almost palpable. He tried to talk to her, approaching her one night while Emma was asleep, but Sarah just looked away, her voice soft and evasive. "It's just work," she said, and Ethan, trying to believe her, accepted her explanation, even if, deep down, he knew there was more to it than she was willing to reveal. The distrust took root in him like a shadow, and the moments he saw her glancing at her phone, smiling at a screen she didn't share with him, added to his unease. One night, when he saw Sarah messaging him in the early hours of the morning, Ethan felt the urge to find out what was going on, to understand the extent to which he was being excluded. Internal tension consumed him, and he no longer knew how to deal with what he suspected. It wasn't just jealousy, it was the painful feeling that something essential between them was being broken. One day, after another meeting between Sarah and Michael, Ethan was waiting for her in the hallway, his eyes full of questions. She entered the house, disconcerted, but tried to disguise her nervousness. However, as her gaze met his, something inside her wavered. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but with a firmness that Sarah hadn't expected. She hesitated, a fraction of a second that revealed more than any answer she could come up with. She mumbled something about work, but the tension in Ethan's eyes grew, and Sarah knew he no longer believed her. The wall she had tried to erect between them was crumbling, and the heavy silence that followed was interrupted only by the sound of the door that she closed as she walked away, quickly going up to the bedroom, where guilt and the fear of losing everything overwhelmed her. Throughout the night, Ethan stayed in the room, his mind immersed in suppositions, in memories that he tried to stitch together in order to understand what was going on. And then, one night, everything became clear to Ethan. He found a message on her cell phone, a short message, but one that said more than any confession. The confirmation came as a blow, a shock that left him without reaction, an internal silence that hurt more than any scream. The betrayal was there, explicit, in words he had never imagined reading from the woman with whom he had shared more than a decade of his life. Sitting in the darkness of the room, Ethan felt himself crumble inside. The revelation was like a blade that cut deep, a wound he knew would never heal. That night, the weight of the discovery prevented him from sleeping. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he had read on Sarah's phone. The confirmation of the betrayal exploded in his mind like a devastating truth, an inescapable reality that threw him into a whirlpool of anger, pain and humiliation. He thought of all the moments they had built together, of every promise, every gesture that now seemed like an empty reflection of something he wasn't sure was real. In the morning, Sarah got up, not noticing Ethan's intense gaze following her. His silence was thick and threatening, but she kept her distance, trying to ignore the obvious signs that something was terribly wrong. Ethan watched her movements with a cutting coldness, analyzing her every gesture as if he were studying a stranger. At one point, no longer able to contain the whirlwind of emotions, he approached her, breaking the silence with a voice that was low but full of intensity. "How long did you intend to keep this from me?" The question cut through the air, and Sarah, hearing Ethan's sharp, determined tone, froze. She stared at him for a moment, trying to understand what he meant, but his gaze, hard and uncompromising, left no room for doubt. He knew. And now there was nowhere to run. Sarah took a deep breath, searching for an answer that would save her, that would soften the impact of that confrontation, but the words seemed to disappear before they even made sense. Ethan, listen to me, his voice wavered, and each attempt at an apology sounded empty, without conviction. He wasn't there to listen to excuses or justifications, he wanted the truth, plain and simple. What happened to us, Sarah? He continued, his voice fluctuating between sadness and restrained despair. At what point did you decide that I wasn't enough anymore? Because, whatever the moment was, you should have told me. The intensity of the words made Sarah look away, unable to bear the pain visible in Ethan's eyes. She tried to speak, but the weight of regret, mixed with the fear of facing the consequences, made it difficult to articulate anything. Finally, in a whisper, she murmured, "It was a mistake. I didn't want things to come to this. I didn't want to hurt you." Her voice faded, and she cringed as she realized the fragility of her own justifications. "A mistake?" Ethan repeated, almost laughing bitterly. "A mistake is something that happens once and you try to correct it. This is something you've continued, Sarah. Something you chose, night after night, and now you want me to believe it was just an oversight." He ran his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration and despair, feeling completely betrayed, lost in a web of lies that she had woven over time. Sarah, speechless, tried to hold back her tears. She didn't know how to explain the inexplicable. She felt an overwhelming desire to run away, to not face the reality that was unfolding before her, but she knew she could no longer escape. And then, in a desperate attempt to buy time, she murmured, "I'm sorry, Ethan. I never wanted things to end like this, and..." The word resounded in him like a blow. "So you've made up your mind? You won't even try to save what's left? Is everything we've lived through together, Sarah, just a burden you want to abandon?" He was incredulous, trying to understand how everything they had built could have shattered like that. She remained silent, her gaze lost. And it was at that moment that something unexpected and brutally honest emerged. Sarah, in a rush of courage and vulnerability, faced Ethan and confessed, "There were times, Ethan, when I felt invisible, as if everything I was just a routine that consumed me. I just wanted to feel like I still mattered to someone." The words hung in the air like a raw confession, devoid of apology. Ethan felt the impact of her words, a truth that pierced like a sharp blade, revealing not only the betrayal, but the depth of the cracks that had formed over the years. He stood there in silence, staring at her, trying to process what it meant to know that she had sought outside the marriage what he believed he could offer within it. But the secret, the real secret, had not yet been revealed, and that was what kept Sarah in a state of contained anguish. The betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg, and Ethan was unknowingly about to discover an even more devastating truth. After a few minutes, Ethan murmured, his voice filled with a dark bitterness, "You let me believe it, Sarah. You let me believe that I was the problem, that maybe I was the one who was failing as a husband, and all this while you were with him." He avoided saying Michael's name, as if the mere mention of it would intensify the pain. Sarah couldn't face him, she couldn't confess what she had been holding back beyond the betrayal, the real secret that she kept locked inside her like a bomb about to explode. She knew that the coming revelation would destroy Ethan in an even more overwhelming way, and for a moment, she almost wished she could keep hiding it forever. Ethan, in a last-ditch effort to understand, held her face, forcing her to look at him. "Why, Sarah? Tell me, why did you choose that? Why didn't you talk to me? I would have done anything to see you happy, to see our family intact. And now, you've destroyed everything, with a man who doesn't even deserve a fraction of what we've built." He let her go, feeling powerless, defeated, and walked away, leaving her alone with her own thoughts, with the weight of the choice she had made. Sarah watched as he walked away, his every step carrying the weight of an entire life that seemed to be falling apart. She knew she was about to face something irreversible, something she could never mend, but at the same time, the truth she was carrying struggled inside her, like a secret that needed to be revealed, whatever the cost. Ethan left the house without looking back, leaving Sarah alone with the silent explosion of her own guilt. The shock of seeing him go still hit her like a blow, and she felt shattered, both by the pain she knew she had caused and by the secret still trapped inside her, a shadow she refused to reveal completely. Sitting in the living room, the echo of Ethan's words rang out, leaving an oppressive void that seemed to suck in all the air around it. He drove aimlessly for a while, until he stopped in a parking lot next to a park, a place where he often walked with Emma on his days off. There, surrounded by the rustling of the trees and the muffled sound of the city in the distance, he let the pain flow, unrestrained. The betrayal was more than he could bear, it was a wound that cut deep, a reality that robbed him of his ground and left him lost. Sitting there, he remembered every detail of the last few years. Images of Sarah with Michael invaded his mind, and even though he had never seen them together, he felt he could visualize what had happened. Sarah's every word and gesture over the last few months now seemed like distorted echoes, fragments of a life that he didn't know if it was true or just a construction made to hide the pain. And as he stood there, alone and silent, he wondered how it had all come to this. Sarah, at home, wandered around the rooms, as if the weight of her memories were a tangible burden, an invisible prison that surrounded her in every corner. She looked at the family photos on the wall, the smiles that now seemed like cruel irony. Each picture was a reminder of everything she had destroyed, everything she had thrown away in a blind impulse, without thinking of the consequences. Emma slept in the next room, innocent, oblivious to the whirlwind that was devastating her parents' world. Sarah knew that the revelation of the betrayal was enough for Ethan. But what would come next, when he knew everything? She sat on the sofa, her hands shaking. There was a terrible dilemma ahead of her: confess the full truth or try to keep what was left secret. She knew that the weight of the secret could destroy her, but she feared that the final revelation, what she was hiding from everyone, could break up with Ethan once and for all, as well as jeopardizing Emma's own emotional stability. The dilemma was eating away at her, and the guilt was crushing her, but part of her wanted to be free, to be rid of the burden of the lie. Hours passed before Ethan returned. His tired, haggard countenance revealed the state of exhaustion he was in. As he entered, he avoided looking at Sarah, heading straight for the bedroom. She followed him, determined to face the weight of the truth that still hung between them, but his expression stopped her. There was something in Ethan's gaze that made her hesitate, as if he were beyond pain, lost in a kind of emotional void. He seemed, at that moment, like an empty shell, a man who had been stripped of all certainties. That night, they shared a bed for the last time. No words were spoken, but the silence between them said more than any argument could. The chasm that had formed was insurmountable, and they both knew that what had once united them was irretrievably broken. In the days that followed, Ethan stayed away, immersed in an almost voluntary solitude. Sarah tried to carry on with her routine, looking after Emma, trying to keep the house in order, but she knew that everything around her was fragile, about to fall apart. With each passing day, the weight of the secret weighed her down a little more, a suffocating feeling that she needed to get it all out in the open, despite the fear that the truth would be the last straw to destroy everything. Finally, one day, when she saw that Ethan was calmer, Sarah felt that she could no longer put off what needed to be done. She called him into the home office for a chat, the place where he spent hours analyzing spreadsheets and organizing the family finances, an essential part of his routine. He looked at her with a neutral expression, but his eyes still held a deep pain. Sarah took a deep breath, the words forming in her mind as she struggled to put them together into something coherent. "Ethan, I need to tell you something else, something that might help you understand everything that's happened," she began, her voice hesitant, fearing his reaction. He remained silent, his face impassive, but she knew he was listening intently. Her hands were shaking, and the air seemed heavy around her, stifling any attempt at relief. "When I started getting involved with Michael, I was so lost, so confused about everything." Sarah tried to find words, but each sentence felt like a blow, each revelation a little torture. She had to choose her words carefully, because she knew she was about to reveal something that would change everything between them. Ethan watched her, his eyes fixed on her, but his expression impenetrable, as if he had erected a wall to protect himself from whatever she said. He didn't know what to expect, but deep down, he felt that anything Sarah said now would be devastating. "Ethan, I feel like everything I did it was out of selfishness, out of wanting to feel something I thought I'd lost." But it wasn't just that. She hesitated, and he realized there was something more, something she was struggling to say. Every second of silence between them increased the tension, and he braced himself for what was to come, although he had no idea what it might be. "I need you to forgive me, but also understand, this wasn't just a betrayal. Michael and things between us went beyond what I imagined." Sarah struggled to breathe, to find the strength in the revelation she had so long avoided, but she knew there was no turning back. The truth was finally out, and the words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. After the last conversation in the office, the silence that settled between Ethan and Sarah was impenetrable, a silence that transcended any attempt at reconciliation. Over the next few days, Ethan observed everything from a distance, like a stranger in his own life. Instead of exploding, he collected every bit of the pain and resentment and began to think about how he would lead what was left of his life. Sarah, for her part, felt trapped in devastating anguish. She knew there were no more excuses and no escape from the consequences of her choices. The betrayal was irreversible, but the weight of the secret, the one she had revealed as a last attempt to be honest, had cast an irreparable shadow over any hope of understanding. Ethan, despite his silent despair, no longer showed any anger, which made everything even more unbearable for her. Without any in-depth dialogue, they both decided to divorce, something that transcended words and became a tacit agreement. Ethan sought legal advice and began the process with a coldness that shocked even Sarah. He knew that maintaining peace and order for Emma was crucial, so he opted for an amicable separation. However, he made it clear that there was no more room for closeness or prolonged conversations. Everything was decided objectively and practically. A few weeks after the divorce was formalized, Ethan began to reorganize his life. He moved into an apartment near his work, a small, simple place that gave him the tranquility he needed to make a fresh start. The loneliness was thick, and the nights were especially challenging. However, he realized that, with each passing day, the pain began to lose its initial intensity, turning into a silent scar that he would learn to carry. Sarah stayed at the house with Emma, trying to adjust her daughter's routine so that Ethan's absence was as little disruptive as possible. Emma, although she didn't fully understand what had happened, felt the sadness in her parents and their emotional instability. Sarah tried to compensate for the loss of Ethan in Emma's life by devoting more attention to her daughter, but she knew that nothing could replace the presence of a father, and that Ethan would always be a fundamental part of the girl's emotional stability. Ethan and Sarah began to meet only at Emma's drop-offs and pick-ups, without exchanging more than a quick hello, avoiding any kind of closeness. They had both accepted that the past was dead, and there was no going back. Their relationship was now just a story of something that had once been real, but had been completely lost in the wrong decisions and inescapable consequences. Michael, Sarah's boss, heard about the divorce and tried to reach out, but Sarah, now immersed in her own guilt and regret, rejected him. She finally realized that her involvement with him had never been based on true feeling, but on a selfish impulse and an illusory need for validation. The emptiness she felt now was even deeper, as there was no longer anything to motivate her to seek solace outside her own reality. She refused any further advances from Michael, cutting him out of her life once and for all. Time passed, and Ethan began to find new purpose. He became involved in voluntary activities, using his lonely nights to invest his time in something that could bring him a sense of meaning. Helping other people made his own problems smaller, and made him reflect on how life, however painful and unexpected, still had something to offer. Emma visited him at weekends, and he made a point of devoting himself completely to her at those times. With each visit, he reinforced his presence in his daughter's life, making sure she always knew how much she was loved and valued. One day, after another visit from Emma, Ethan took her to the park where they used to go on their days off. She laughed, ran and played, and Ethan watched her with an affection and love that transcended any past hurts. Seeing his daughter's joy made him feel that, despite everything, there was something worthwhile. Those shared moments filled him with hope and peace, and he allowed himself to smile again, in a way he hadn't done for a long time. Sarah, at home, was also trying to rebuild something new. She knew that her life would never be the same, that Ethan and everything they had built would never be recovered. But over time, she began to look for ways to understand and accept her own failings, facing the weight of her mistakes without trying to run away. She plunged into therapy, determined to discover and repair the roots of her own insecurity and impulsiveness. The process was long and painful, but with each session she felt a little closer to a new understanding of herself. The meetings with Ethan became increasingly friendly, and they both managed to establish a relationship of mutual respect, especially for Emma's sake. Even though they had never been friends, they had learned to get along and respect each other's presence. Ethan knew that Sarah carried her own burden and that, despite everything, she was the mother of his daughter and would continue to play that role in Emma's life. They both wanted their daughter to have a healthy childhood and youth, so they maintained an atmosphere of peace and harmony whenever they were around her. Their final separation, however, brought something unexpected for Ethan, a new perspective on life. He realized that, as painful as the betrayal and the collapse of his marriage had been, the experience had transformed him into a stronger, more empathetic person. He came to appreciate every little moment of happiness more and found the strength to move on without carrying the weight of resentment. He still felt the sadness of an irreparable loss, but over time he was able to replace this feeling with a silent gratitude for the good times they had had and for everything he had learned along the way. As for Sarah, she never fully forgave herself, but learned to accept the consequences of her actions. She lived with the pain of what she had lost and the awareness of what she had done. However, this suffering was transformed into an inner strength, a responsibility to herself and to Emma. She dedicated herself to the role of mother, finding a new form of love and dedication in raising her daughter. Although she would never be able to erase the mistakes of the past, Sarah made every day an opportunity to show Emma that, even after the worst mistakes, personal redemption was possible. Ethan and Sarah's story didn't end as in fairy tales, but each found a way to rebuild their own lives. Emma grew up surrounded by the love of both parents, who, despite the pain and the past, did everything in their power to ensure that she had a happy childhood. They learned that true love transcends romanticism and that, in the end, it's also about acceptance and respect, even when life doesn't go the way they imagined. Ethan, now more mature and at peace with his past, continued to live fully, while Sarah, every day, dealt with the weight of her choices and the consequences she decided to face. For both of them, the end of their marriage was a turning point, a bitter but essential lesson in the value of trust and the consequences of breaking it. So, what did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments what you think of the characters and their choices. Subscribe to the channel for more impactful and reflective stories like this one. Remember, we don't support any kind of betrayal here. The stories serve as a reminder of the devastating impact that a lack of loyalty can have.